Hello everyone and welcome to the From a Writer's Perspective podcast, in which we will dissect the stories that influenced us, analyze how they're created, and explore more about the writers behind them. When we look back at some of the most anticipated releases, we sometimes see that the idea itself and the potential behind it failed in its execution. We often see this in prequels or projects that have gone through a tedious, ambitious process. So how does this happen? And how, as a writer, can you identify these pitfalls? I am Kirian Storms, and with me is my dear friend Edie Leonard. And you are listening to the From a Writer's Perspective podcast. I'm currently replaying Red Dead Redemption because as we wanted to develop this episode, what came up to me is that this was a game that had a lot of anticipation, and there was also a great product at the end, which is rare. And a lot of the stories that we're talking about, they kind of wanted to achieve the same thing. So I kind of wanted to play through that and see like, okay, what does Red Dead Redemption do very well that, for instance, a Destiny or a Cyberpunk don't do well?
Did you get an answer?
I did, but I'm not going to spoil it yet because then we wouldn't have an episode, of course.
Fair point.
There you go. So, and that's a little bit what the episode is going to be about, of course, anticipation. How much anticipation do you actually build up before the weight of it kind of boulders through the end product? Because that's what we see with a lot of these titles, is that it's just production hell, a lot of anticipation. And at some point, you just fill in the blanks yourself. And then when the end product is there, the way that you filled it in is not the way they filled it in. Or it's just horrible. It's just, technically a bug fest. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there's that is something that was on my mind lately. But that's good. Either way, so to the meat of the podcast episode. Are there a few projects that come to mind when I say there's a lot of anticipation and the end product kind of failed it in that sense?
The things that failed, I think one of your favorites, Cyberpunk, which we both played, Destiny, but now we're talking video games.
Yeah.
I think, I always compare Cyberpunk to Fallout. It's just a different Fallout game. But yeah, I think Fallout as well. Fallout 76, the big MMO.
Yeah. The microtransaction monster.
Yeah, but those are some things that come to mind, for me at least. I don't know if you have got some different takes on it.
Star Wars. There was a lot of anticipation after the Disney buy of what are they going to do. And the initial first 3 movies were an incredible disaster. And I'm looking at, for instance, Visions, The Mandalorian, and the Book of Boba Fett as things that did do well and that do capture the spirit of Star Wars in the way that I personally like it a lot and does things that create interesting narrative. So why do you think this happens? Why do you think this big anticipation throughout the years gets built up, and why do game studios do that? And also, why does it always seem that the story itself of a game then kind of succumbs under that weight?
I think it's a marketing thing. Marketeers, they always have this job, and I think you know it as well as I do. You can promise people golden mountains, and then when the end product gets released, it's always less than what you're promising.
Yeah, all that glitters is not gold, definitely. That is very true.
Yeah, and I think, let's take Cyberpunk, for example. They've shown all these trailers and things you could do and promises they made. And in the end, I think their ambition was just too big. Because if you look at it, comparing it to Red Dead Redemption, Rockstar is a AAA studio, but CD Projekt Red is still an independent studio, so they probably don't have the budget or the manpower to really build what they had envisioned.
From what I remember when we talked about this a while ago and we looked this up, it was a budget of 380 million towards 520 million. I don't know for sure. The budget for Red Dead Redemption was 550 million. Man, that and it shows, to be honest. It's from storytelling to performance. But the thing is also, because I looked into Cyberpunk quite a lot, because now it's actually running really well. This is something that happened to The Witcher as well. And then later The Witcher got really good reviews because it's fixed that. However, what I found is that if you look at even Mafia 2, like very old games, if you shoot in the water or if you throw a grenade in the water will blow up. Like they have good engines for that. If you look at the first release of Cyberpunk, they didn't even have that. I think that because they were too ambitious and they were focusing on all these innovations, and you can tell that from the marketing as well. If you look at what they focused on, from the fashion to the cars to all these little stupid things, I think that the basis itself, the foundation got lost. And that's what caused a lot of these performance issues. And I also think that this has to do with a little bit of the process itself. I think that Keanu Reeves coming into the story and saying, I want a bigger part, does had to change the story to find space for him in certain missions that have a little bit to do with the whole story behind Mr. Blue Eyes, the paralysis and all those things. You kind of find that there's so much scripted emotions in there, like cinematography, the mist that happens.
I think it also we've seen the little footage of the black guy with the metal arm.
Dex, yeah. You're talking about the third person cutscenes, right?
Yeah.
T-Bug is still in there.
Yeah, this cutscene, but it got removed and it suddenly didn't all make sense anymore in the end product. I think you know it better as I do.
They wanted to make it more immersive by making everything first person, which I have to say that I like Red Dead Redemption because it has beautiful cinematography. Destiny has beautiful cinematography in certain moments. There's a cinematic approach to things, which I don't think Cyberpunk has. And I think that is his biggest flaw, because it's such a beautiful world, but not having that cinematography in there, it kind of takes away the direction. There's this army movie, 1917, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well, that has a great cinematographer behind it, and you can see that, and it kind of helps to translate the story in that sense. There's multiple Batmans, but I think the one that has great cinematography and the one that tries to go deeper into the character. But we've talked about the interpersonal.
But I think Zelda, from a story perspective, is one of the worst. Well, it's I don't know. No, I don't think it's Zelda. It's also Mario and then just Nintendo games. It always boils down to save the damsel in distress, whether it's Princess Zelda herself or Princess Peach. The best story of Zelda isn't even from a Zelda game. It's from Hyrule Warriors. You've got the champions. There are these heroes from different races. So you got the bird race and the stone people race and the fish race. And they all put forward a hero to defeat the biggest bad. From a story perspective, in the first Breath of the Wild, well, it was just, here's the world and go ahead, explore. And you could find a few memories, but there was not really a lot of story. But then they made Hyrule Warriors as a sort of prequel to it. It's just a hack and smash game. But they did put in a lot of cutscenes and see the character dynamics, which in a true Zelda game you would never see it. So that's why Zelda or Mario work so well, is because the execution, to keep it within the episode theme, the execution is just perfect.
If I hear you well, this all sounds like there's a quite simple idea, there's a very singular vision, and then there's just really great execution.
Yeah.
It's that kind of ingredient list that makes for a great experience. I think that focusing on the basis, having a sturdy idea, having one singular vision of what is this story about, and then just executing it, I think a lot of people lose themselves in that process. Destiny had its issue with the process itself, where the man in suits basically said, hey, start over from scratch and you have 1 year.
They just had this story and they cut it up into all these pieces.
Yeah, and even like parts go to other DLC, and you need to pay X amount of money, which is hundreds of euros, to get the full story, and even then parts of it get migrated to Destiny 2 and Destiny 3 probably.
But also what Destiny did really well in their execution, and I think it's the same with Halo. It's a perfect shooter.
It has perfect handling. Yeah, it's in what it has to do. There it is, really, really good. However, and that's the big problem and difference between Destiny and Halo. The thing that works in Halo is that you have a very simple idea. There's a soldier. He gets an AI. He basically has to battle the enemy, as they land on a ring, and the enemy is going through that ring for a reason. And it's this big weapon of mass destruction, and very John McClane, he has to basically kill the enemy, secure the weapon, and destroy or use it. Destiny didn't have the grand story, promised to be something revolutionary where you would use your phone, you would use your console, and you would have people flying into the game and out of the game whenever they wanted to. It was this very seamless experience. And it would even have voices from Peter Dinklage. It would have incredibly rich lore and incredibly rich world building. And all the world building eventually was all lost in the grimoire. The story itself was very bland. The gameplay, even though the shooting was great, the loading moments where you just hovered in midair with your glider or whatever you call it, there's also very tedious parts of it. And the whole go to a certain place, stand there for 5 minutes, either the capture the flag or King of the Hill kind of, game elements. For me, while the shooting itself was very fun, the rest of it was not fun at all.
What was fun was the community. I remember Barthes, who made all these theory videos. When he explained everything, it was like, wow, they really thought this through. It's just a pity that it didn't come in the game.
No, it was all in the grimoire cards, which...
Yeah, and it's not a problem if they have grimoire cards, but not that you have to open your mobile phone or go to your computer to read them.
This is a big problem with games. All these games that have like documents that you have to read to or audio files you have to listen to. It's this show don't tell kind of thing. It's just you don't want to read a game. You want to experience a game.
Yeah, that's true.
I think this is the same with the process that we went through when we were writing our first story, The Youth. We had a lot of asterisks and footnotes. People don't want to interrupt the story and go through the footnotes to understand what you're talking about. They don't want to go to the index at the back of the book to understand your world. You either let things open and let them create with their fantasy what this world is about and how they interpret it. This also goes into the Barthes theory of the death of the author, where a story isn't solely in the hands of a writer. When you give someone an idea, they will fill it in their head in their own way. And once you have 10 years of anticipation, which games like Cyberpunk have, which Final Fantasy 15 had. Destiny had a long process behind it. If you then release like little snippets and then let the rest just kind of like run rampant with their own imagination, at some point that anticipation comes with so many own truths of what that story should be. They themselves will be like, well, this is not what I expected. This is not the direction or tone I expected it to be. That is also why, as a writer, you should start with short stories. You don't want to have a process where either midway you get sick and tired of it, which we talked a little bit about it with the George R. R. Martin episode. And you want to have that gratification of, I finished a standalone story and it took me maybe a month max, and that's my short story, and I can build from there. Train yourself to at least finish things and make it compact, make it lean. Starting with a trilogy, doing the world building for a trilogy, all that stuff. You will go through different ideas, then all of a sudden you get a revolutionary idea within an idea, and you think, hey, I have to change everything. Then 3 chapters have to be deleted and you have to start all over again. That is not a fun process, and it's also not a fun way to start your writing career.
In hindsight, we can say start with a short story, and that would be my advice as well. But I think every fantasy author is starting with, I want to write a trilogy.
I think that's maybe a little bit of a generational thing of our time, that we want to make things big and grand and bigger than the next thing. But William Gibson started with short stories. Stephen King started with short stories. Even George R. R. Martin started with short stories. Like, all these writers know that they just have to start with short stories.
Well, they got published with a short story, but was that their intention?
I think that back then there was just not the idea of you can make it yourself. So the way of making money, the fastest and most frequent, and to not invest too much time in something and then maybe it either working or not, which happens way more than it working. I think it's just that.
Yeah, and they published it in magazines.
Exactly, so they got money from it, like maybe 800 euros from a story, maybe even 150 euros, but it was money, and then the next month they'll do something else. And, they all made short stories because that's the only way to survive. If you start with a big story that you need a year for, where's the money coming from to eat?
Yeah, but I've also seen this interview with Brandon Sanderson. I believe he wrote very big stories, and when he sent it to a publisher, and they were like, "No, we're not interested," he was like, "All right, not this one. Here, have another one." And he had all these very big stories. So I don't know if you.
But don't you need that repertoire to prove that you can actually create something from start to bottom? Because else you just show the first 3 chapters and you try to get budget to write the rest of the story itself. But this rarely ever happens, and it's so little money.
You have to be talented, but you also have to be lucky. But that's
and hard work. And that brings me to the number 3. You can be too ambitious, and in that way you can lose the basis. You can lose your vision, or have like a team that gets like split in like 2 ways of doing it, and the end product is basically a compromise, which we had a little bit as well. Mm-hmm. Or you could be too perfectionistic. You can start with 20-page outlines and be very perfectionistic in that. And the idea behind that is that the magic just burns out from the idea to the execution.
I think it's better to be too perfectionistic, but I don't know how you feel about this. I believe Shigeru Miyamoto once said, a delayed game will at some point be good, but a rushed game will forever be bad.
I don't know if I agree with that, because that's the thing. Cyberpunk now is being seen very differently than from a year ago. And The Witcher, which started as a rushed, very flawed game, The Witcher 3, it had the same issues in the beginning. We don't know that because we played the game a lot later, but take us still through all the updates. However, that's with a game. If you talk about a story and you talk about writing, that is definitely true.
I think he also said it years ago when there weren't all these updates and when there weren't online games. So yeah, but still, I don't think it's an excuse to just let's bring out the game and we'll patch it with all these updates.
But that's a nice thing that you say now, because that brings me back to something I said before. The idea that if you always believe that you have more time than you actually have. Mm-hmm. If you think, hey, tomorrow I'll write 3 pages, then you're pushing it to tomorrow. And maybe tomorrow life happens again, and then you still don't have those 3 pages. So it's also don't try to see it as a mountain again, and try to, at some point let things go. Sure, things need to be self-contained. Don't get me wrong. I think a very good self-contained short story, there's beauty in that. But don't work for a half year on a short story.
Well, let's take one of our stories of the captain, the admiral.
Yes.
We just started with let's try one more short novel or novella. I think in the end we also ended up in around 300 pages, so that's a decent amount. But anyway, I believe I pitched the idea of let's have this admiral. He needs to defeat the bad guy, and then he returned. But then we were looking at, all right, what the society looks like, and basing it on the Dutch society of a few hundred years ago. There was slavery and
the abolition that was happening.
Exactly, and all these elements made the story and the world interesting, in my opinion. It's a pity that no one has ever read it, and I'm going to try to do my best to make it one day work.
Yeah. But I think that what the beauty behind that is that we were walking through, like we're just walking on autopilot, talking about why isn't this working and why is everything taking so long. And at some point you were like, hey, what if we just do something small, because we're probably in a rut. We just need something else.
We wanted to finish something, and first story was about, well, let's say 90 chapters. Second one was about 20, but then we decided, you know what, we're missing something. Let's add 70 more, and it just nothing worked out.
You get into the outline, you fall in love with these characters, and you just want to dive deeper. It's the same thing that happened with George R. R. Martin and his branching storylines, and you never know how far it branches.
Yeah, and to keep it within the confines of the concept of this episode, you fall in love with the potential.
Yes, exactly. Plus, I think that your first story in this generation and era, where we are very, very distracted and not as purist as we used to be. But in the beginning, you aren't that dedicated and you're not that good. You have to get good throughout the 10,000 hours. And what is a better training? A trilogy or a whole series or a short story? And I think failing with like 1 or 5 short stories and then getting gradually good and getting that sense of fulfillment from finishing it every time and having things to show, so much value in that.
Yeah, and you never waste time, because everything, even if you write 5 short stories and you're like, why am I not being published yet? You've got the experience, and you need the experience to at one point be published. You just have to work hard. And working hard gives you experience, and then you need a little bit of luck and I think networking.
So one thing that I'm also very curious about, and this is the fourth and last thing that I think can mess up a good idea. You've told in the past that once you start writing a short story, you have an idea, but you don't have an outline, so you kind of know how it ends, probably, but not always even. Mm-hmm. And you go into it, you create this anticipation, and then it has to lead somewhere. And I know you haven't seen Lost, but I think you get the basic premise of there's a lot of mystery around a lot of J.J. Abrams products, but he's not great at finishing them. Mm-hmm. I would even say that not knowing how something ends can be very difficult for a story, because at some point you have this idea that you're in love with. You have this kind of setup, but then you need to land it at some point. And what if you can't land it? So what do you think about that? Like, what do you need at least to start a story? Do you think you need to know the ending?
Well, maybe it's the only thing that you know when you start a story. You know the ending, and then you're like, all right, how are they gonna get there?
Exactly.
When you look at Squid Game, I'm just going to spoil things. This officer who falls off a cliff, but is he dead or is he not? and that's just something they just anticipated one season, but since it's such a big success, I wouldn't be surprised if a season 2 came. And then, well, who's going to pop up? The Mr. Police Officer. I think the same goes with Lost. I haven't seen it, but you're just going to have one season which needs a semi-closed ending, and after that, yeah, you can get the danger of just making it too convoluted. Like, all right, now we're writing something and we can never end it anymore, and then they woke up or they are in the afterlife,
or you keep creating more mystery, and at some point you're like, okay, this engine only runs on mystery anymore at this point, and that's a big problem. It's also this thing with Lovecraft has this a little bit as well, where he tries to build up this monster and then he ends it with it's horror. It's almost too horrible to explain it, so he doesn't explain it, and then he has that with a lot of stories where he gets very vague with it. But I think that at some point also helps, because keeping certain things vague, and again then going to Barthes and letting the reader fill in some things for themselves, it can have great power, and there's great strength in not knowing. It's very parallel to life.
But I don't know if the death of the authors, if you can apply it to theories as well. Because, for example, my first short stories, I've sent it to a few of my friends to proofread it. And one of them was like, oh yeah, and they get at the lake and I really see the Nordic fjords, and which was completely not my intention, because I've written this marsh-like semi-tropical environment. I've written about mangrove trees. Well, if you know about mangrove trees, they do not grow in a Nordic climate. So
and that's to kind of explain to everyone what the death of the author means in this respect, because it's a 7-page theory that has a few points. Mm-hmm. In this sense, it's if you read Harry Potter for the first time and you think Hermione is beautiful, then you can think Hermione is beautiful. If you read Game of Thrones for the first time and you think that Peter Dinklage should play the dwarf, despite someone saying that it's a horribly wretched creature, then there's no wrong in interpreting it in that way. And the author in that sense is dead, because once it's delivered, it's handed in. It's for the reader himself or the one going through the experience to experience it in their way, and that is the only truth that in the end, that's the one that lasts. And that is a little bit the idea behind that. And I think that is, if you have a lot of marketing for any story, that interpretation itself, mm-hmm. it can go so far that it gets in the way of even enjoying the end product. And I think that's the same with Lost, with the mystery. If you have so much mystery, at some point people start filling in like, I think it's this, I think it's that. You had it with Westworld, by the way, as well. That is an interesting one, definitely. The first season of Westworld is a mastermind marvel. It's incredible. And it has one of these endings to in itself a little bit of a self-contained story, that if you look back and you watch the season 1 3 times, you will start picking up things. But it contained that mystery, it made that mystery fun, and it paid off. And it's a very rare thing. And in that sense, and that's also very funny, Westworld is very much alike like Red Dead Redemption. It's Westworld's setting is people kind of like GTA playing into this kind of like Disney World environment, but it's themed towards cowboys and the Wild West. So it's very much like playing Red Dead Redemption. You see how that line between whether it's a theme park or whether it's actually a dangerous place, it starts to change, and the hosts start to take over in certain senses, and they start to break free and become, they evolve. And it's part of this bigger plan, and but all this mystery lingers to the end. And then all of a sudden it's the same as 7. We talked about that as well, right? Until the end, you don't really see the bad guy, except for him being the journalist that takes a photo, and all of a sudden him showing up in that hallway. It's that mystery surrounding that person where you have a great tension and anticipation, this very Hitchcock way of building pressure, and it builds to this phenomenal ending. And that's why I do think in some way you do need like an outline.
Looking at my first short stories, the first 4, I only had the beginning and the end. And well, sometimes it's really stupid. Sometimes you've got this one scene in your mind. For example, for the last one, these towers on wheels, and they put them against the wall.
Yeah, exactly.
To climb up and climb over the wall to fight the enemy.
Yeah.
And it was just this thing that I find it so fascinating that they covered them in wet hides so they wouldn't catch fire. That was the breaking point, because I had this story like, all right, I want to write about the end of the Bavarian Empire, but how am I going to do it? And then this minor detail just suddenly clicked, and the story just finished itself. And that's just in your whole writing process. There's these weird tiny details that can just suddenly make it click.
I think it's the same with your second story, by the way. To kind of go into that process. You had your story, and there were a lot of repeating structures inside that story that came back again, and you got to the end and I was like, wait, but I think that there needs to be a lot more happening in between, and what is the relationship between these two people? And then the focus started changing, and there was all of a sudden this very singular vision, and there was this, even in world building, there was this very singular vision.
No, and that's the advantage of a short story. You can easily delete 1 or 2 pages, maybe 3. I'm a very action-based writer, so at a certain point of my second story, there was a chapter with a fight scene, three chapters with a fight scene after one another. And that's the beauty of the writing process. You can just write it, then you're going to read it and you're like, it doesn't quite feel right. You just have to limit yourself.
The great takeaway in that is that you did it after finishing the story already and having like a base skeleton.
Yeah, and you take some things away, you add some more things. So
what else can we kind of note down to each other? What would you say are the main points that would be great for every writer? Besides obviously the much pointed out thing, start with short stories.
I think the biggest pitfall of all these franchises we've mentioned so far is the marketing.
Yeah.
And well, you mentioned Red Dead Redemption or GTA in the beginning.
Yeah.
They don't start their marketing until the game almost comes out. But if you start your marketing 7 years prior to releasing your project,
like Cyberpunk, like Destiny,
yeah, or
even Game of Thrones, the anticipation has been going for 11 years for this book.
Yeah, and I think a book is a bit more patient than a game or a movie or a TV series.
Yeah, paper is more patient than pixels, basically.
But yeah, I think of all these projects, the marketing is setting a certain expectation, and well, then it can only
disappoint. Yeah, no, I get that. So yeah, I would definitely take that point. I think having a singular vision of what the story is meant to achieve, that is very important. Don't be too perfectionistic. Don't finish a story, then lose years in finishing it or months in finishing it and never bringing it out. Once in a while, there needs to be an expiration date, I think. And don't use mystery as a way to create popularity in a story. Mystery can be part of a story, but you should always know how something will end. If the mystery is the biggest excitement of the story, you probably have a big problem with creating a successful ending.
Don't create mysteries for yourself. But I guess we can wrap it up.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot. We want to thank everyone for listening to this one. This was another episode of From a Writer's Perspective.